Hi, so thanks for tuning in to another episode of Creepy Christmas, where I will be reading spooky Christmas tales for the month of December, just in the off chance that you, like me, get a little too much cheer, not enough spook during the holiday season. Today I will be reading Christmas Carol by Lisa Vasquez. As always, you can check out more of her work in the description. If you end up liking this video and want to check out more, make sure that you either follow the playlist or subscribe to the channel. I look forward to sharing this piece with you and to continuing the series. Upon the wintry eve of December 23rd, there was a sound till then ne'er heard, a scream more chillin' than ocean's depth. It stole God's name from beneath the breath. Carol fell asleep to the sound of a crackling fire and the warmth of it on her young cheeks, smiling with thoughts of Christmas morning dreams. Her room was already warm, but curling into her favorite afghan added an extra layer of comfort for her. It was not only Christmas in 2 days, it was her birthday, and she'd turned 7 this year. The smells from the kitchen where her mother and grandmother were baking wafted upstairs until at last her little mind went away to where little girls dream. The frightful sounds to which she awoke is one that no child should ever have to wake to. The barely conscious girl was so frightened by the sounds of them that she lost control of her bladder. A warm puddle formed between her legs, but she could not move, only stare into darkness, with eyes as large and as round as saucers. She could feel her breath coming in short, quick bursts to allow her tiny lungs to fill with as much oxygen as possible. The fear was on her chest, forcing her into the mattress with the weight of it. There was nothing but screaming rising up the old wooden stairs, slithering across the walls, and shaking the bed with its desperation. When they stopped, the silence was just as painful to her ears. They continued to ring, disorienting her, and when she sat up, the entire room swayed around her. Papa? In the room that suddenly became so much larger, her voice sounded small and frail. She listened, but there was no response. Panic swelled up inside her. Her blood rushed back into her frozen limbs, and her tears felt cold against her flushed cheeks. Papa, where are you? What's happening? There was nothing but silence looming in the open doorway, with the shadows cast on the walls by flickering candlelight. The thought of her parents being harmed was the only source of courage strong enough to persuade her to move, as she did now, swinging one leg off the bed until her toes touched the frigid floor. She hesitated, praying for her father's voice to come back through the blackness before she'd have to force her other leg to meet the first. Carol could feel the constriction of her throat when she tried to swallow, and her teeth began to chatter. She was breathing so fast, her head began to feel faint. To steady herself, she reached out for her bedside table and flinched. Her fingers had touched the beads of her rosary. A sense of hope came over her, and she collected it into her palm, clutching it to her chest, but the relief it offered was short-lived. From behind her, she heard the heavy fall of footsteps coming towards her. After so many years of hearing her father climb them to kiss her goodnight, Carol knew whomever they belonged to was not him. The chill of the air reminded her that her nightdress was wet, and the thin cloth was clinging to her thighs. Soaked in the smell of urine, she ran and hid behind a panel of thick curtains bunched together on either side of her window. The heavy sound of steps drew closer, and she pressed her back against the wall. As was human nature, the girl had to see the face of the terror that woke her up that night. She had to see the explanation for the screams before her imagination sent her spiraling into madness. And so, as gently as she could, she leaned forward and peeked at the doorway. The rays of the moon shone down onto it like a spotlight, waiting for the star to appear. At first, there were only long shadows stretching from the floor to the door. Carol shivered, not only from the cold, but from anticipation of who, or what, the shadow belonged to. With each step, the shadow grew closer. The girl's heart slammed against her ribs, like a bird desperate to be free of its cage. What appeared first was a hoof, a singular, thick hoof, glistening with fresh snow. Her feet had grown roots where she stood. Trailing her eyes up from the hoof was blonde fur covering legs like that of a lamb. The small girl's mind could barely process it, and her lungs forced out a breath in shock. That minute-whispered exhale drew the animal's attention. Filling the doorway, the creature appeared, haunting and terrifying all at once. Her eyes glistened like a father's whiskey, gold and unnatural. She could see Carol. Not only could she see Carol, she could see through her. The small girl could feel the creature's gaze penetrate her skin and touch everything inside of her. Upon the thing's head were horns like a ram that spiraled back into a curl against a mane of honey. She was dressed, yes, dressed, in animal furs covered in more of the fresh snow, now melting into small gem-like beads and hypnotizing Carol from her hiding spot. Against her own will, she came from behind the curtains and walked towards the beast. A scream was welling up in her lungs but could not find escape. She opened her mouth wide but felt as though something clutched at her throat. The beautiful terror leaned forward, and Carol was able to see her features more clearly. Her face was bathed in blood. Carol's mother's blood. The girl fought to get free of the monstrous grasp holding her still when the creature leaned forward to take a deep breath, inhaling Carol's scent. When she drew back and smiled, Carol could see rows of jagged teeth and pieces of her mother's hair between them. The scream locked in her small throat began to fight for freedom, with sounds of gagging and gurgling. "Yes," the beast hissed. "Scream." Like the sound that woke her to this nightmare, Carol was finally able to unleash the repulsion and shock. The force of her scream ripped at the delicate tissues in her throat, yet she continued despite the pain until the air ran out of her lungs. The monster's eyes closed, seduced by the sound of it, and when she opened her eyes again, Carol saw the hunger in them. All the girl had in defense was her rosary and prayer, so she closed her eyes, brought the beads to her lips, then began to pray. "Saint Michael, the Archangel, defend us in the day of battle. Be our safeguard against the wickedness and the snares." Before the final word could be spoken, Carol felt her body falling, and her head collided heavily and painfully with the ground. She tried to sit up to see what happened, but the blow blurred her vision. She could only make out shapes. Someone else was in there with her and the monster. "Papa?" Crawling on the floor toward the struggle, she was desperate to know if her father was there. She needed to know if he was safe and that he would protect her. The figure saw Carol and threw the beast down to the floor, plunging something that looked like a sword into her chest before turning and running at Carol. "Oh God, what's happened?" she cried, reaching out for him. The figure leaned in, showing his true face, pressing a single finger against his lips. "Shh." Without another sound, Carol went limp. No matter how many logs Carol put onto the fire, the heat would not penetrate her bones. Resignedly, she sat back, releasing a deep sigh. A plume of condensation hung in the air in front of her. Tight, near-frozen fingers curled into the worn, old afghan her mother had made for her many years ago, and she pulled it around her. Everything was so stiff. Behind her, the wind howled against the oversized cathedral windows. The thin panes of glass rattled and shook in protest. There were no clouds in the sky, where the bright moon stared back at her. The snowflakes were so enormous they seemed to float past like large sails topping ships on a midnight ocean. Grant me, O Lord, the strength to endure. Keep me warm in your glory. The prayer was offered, despite knowing it would not be heard. Taking her rosary from her lap, she brought it to her lips to kiss the frozen metal of the crucifix that dangled from the beads. Carol had been known to carry the same rosary with her everywhere since she was a young girl. Children often teased her for her piety by calling her names and excluding her from play, but it only made her conviction stronger. Despite their cruelty, she would include them in her prayers, and in the small hours of the night, passers-by could see her silhouette behind the glow of a single candle in the second-story window, until the night her parents were slaughtered and she disappeared. Carol's eyes never recovered from the night she was assaulted as a child. The world was a mass of blurry, monochromatic shapes. Since that night when she was 7, Carol was never able to see properly again until the 23rd of December. Looking down at the street below, she could see a figure staring up at her. It was the anniversary of that deadly night when he would appear and she could see him. The madness of the misshapen world would part, and his face would come through in all his brilliance, and she would relive it again. Over and over, each year, for nearly 100 years, the battle between the beast and the figure would be replayed, keeping Carol's spirit locked here in limbo as their pawn and their link to the material realm. The children in town were brought to her home, and the story was recited to warn them about staying up too late on Christmas Eve. To ward off evil, they would gather and close their eyes while singing Christmas hymns by candlelight. "Why do we have to keep our eyes closed?" one of the children asked. The legend says that if you catch even the smallest glance of the creature, you'll go blind, her mother explained. "What creature, Mummy?" "The one with the hooves, Ivy. Now be a good girl and close your eyes. We'll light your candle for you. When you hear the others sing, you join in." Ivy closed her eyes and felt a hand touch hers. Her brother, Eamon, who was blind since birth, stood beside her. "I know you can't see, Eamon, but keep your eyes closed too," Ivy whispered. The children could tell it was nearly time to start. The rustling of clothing had gone quiet, and the talking had ceased. The bells from the church rang out, announcing the time to begin, and they all began. The first notes carried up toward the window, illuminated with an amber glow. Carol stood in front of the glass in silence, staring down at the only figure she could see. Tears fell from her eyes in anticipation of the anniversary of her eternal hell. The voice of the sopranos carried higher and louder than the others, triggering the memory of the screams of her mother on that tragic night. Carol clutched her rosary until her palm was bleeding. Behind her, the sounds of the hooved beast caused her to spin around. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost behind the veil of the spirit world, and instead the world outside heard only the sound of singing coming from the window. The figure who Carol waited for every year walked toward the door and stopped. Turning slowly, he looked down at the boy, blind from birth, who could now see him through another's eyes. The beast was watching him through the boy's eyes, and the boy was seeing him too. The devil smiled at the boy, gave him a wink, and went to save Christmas Carol. Thanks so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoyed that story. If you'd like to see more of Lisa Vasquez's work, please make sure you check out the links in the description. If you would like to hear more creepy Christmas tales, make sure that you follow the playlist or subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be putting out new videos every day. assuming everything goes as planned. So make sure that you tune in for those.